Hi, everyone. Welcome again. Let's give people a minute to join in and fix their computers and internet, then we will start. All right, welcome to the second panel of today. And I'd just like to introduce the chair or the moderator for the panel, and I will hand it over to him to continue the rest of the discussions. Dr. Tebeje Molla is a Discovery Early Researcher Award DECRA Fellow in the School of Education at Deakin University, Australia. He's currently leading a research project that explores higher education participation among African Australian youth from refugee backgrounds. Today, he's going to be the moderator of this panel. Dr. Tebeje, over to you.
Thanks, Matthew. Welcome, everyone. We're happy you join us. And I would like to formally open the session with an acknowledgement of country. I would like to acknowledge the Watrang people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of this unceded land from which I am coming to you, and pay my respect to their elders and the past and present. I also extend my respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island peoples who might be here with us today. We have three impressive presentations for this session. The first session is by Guido on the challenges of an Afro-Brazilian living in Australia. The second presentation is by Franka from University of Melbourne. Guido is from Victoria University. Franka from University of Melbourne, talking on the negotiating at homeness among diasporic Liberians. And the last presentation by David and his colleagues from University of Western Australia, focus on development diplomacy and the diaspora, especially focusing on examining African Australians' engagement in Australia-Africa relations. A couple of housekeeping notes. Each presenter will speak for about 15 minutes, and I will send a text message when you are left with 3 minutes. And finally, I will wave my hand to let you know that your time is up. The Q&A session will follow after all the three papers have been presented. Now, I pass the virtual mic to Guido. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, so I'm going to go straight into it. I am an Afro-Brazilian. The Africans in Brazil are the largest diaspora of Africans outside of Africa. And in the whole Latin America, excluding the United States, there is 250 million African descendants. Anyway, let's go straight up. So my presentation is about the challenge of being an Afro-Brazilian living in Australia, and how migrating while Black brings challenges for Afro-Brazilians and Afro-Latinos in Australia today. And then the second part is how creating a modern Quilombo can be, can help us resist and exist as a people and as a group. So basically, it's important to acknowledge that, you know, the Afro-Brazilians are part of the largest diaspora outside of Africa. And we have been in the Americas from the early 1500s, so the 16th century. So what is Quilombo, right? Quilombo, it's the European way of addressing us as a resistance group. So when in the 1500s, when we first arrived, some accounts say we arrived in the 1526, but the official accounts today says 1539. is that when the first Afro-Brazilian landed in the Americas, or African enslaved landed in the Americas. And as early as 1595, there was already resistance. So the whole idea that we did not resist, or we did not attempt to create, to have autonomy, it's unfounded. And you know, that type of resistance in Brazil is called quilombo, because that's how the word was addressed in Brazil, specifically by the Portuguese colonizers. Originated from, some people say it's originated from the word, from the Quimbundo word quilombo, meaning camp, war camp, and it happens in other countries as well. So you have in the Americas, like in the Caribbean, some people say maroons. In Colombia, it's called palenques. In other places, it's called carabali. So different places. So what is the Afro-resistance? The Afro-resistance, it's a group founded in about 4 years ago, 2017, 5 years ago, by a psychologist named Kiki Rodriguez. She's Afro-Brazilian from the south of Brazil. And she felt, and I think there was a collective feeling, that we did not, the issues addressed by the mostly left-wing groups we're part of were not being addressed in racial terms. So the Afro-resistance came to sort of address those realities. The history of Brazil was written by the colonizers, by the white colonizers. So it's also important to know that these epistemologies that I'm trying to create right now are new, because for the first 5 centuries of Brazilian colonization, most of this history is being told by white men, you know, of Portuguese or other descents. So it has been really hard to even have any knowledge of what happened, because the interpretation is based on the racial aspects of the elements of those people writing the history. So Beatriz Nascimento was an early, already on the 20th century, but an early Afro-Brazilian woman who worked in creating these new epistemologies of how we see ourselves and how our resistance and existence happens today in Brazil. As I said, the first documents of Palmares, which is the biggest quilombo in Brazil, which is this place of resistance, from 1597. And the destruction of this place happened only about 100 years later, in 1695. I believe that Palmares, the Quilombo of Palmares, which is this place of resistance, was the first African kingdom outside of Africa, you know, and was hundreds of years before the Haitian Revolution, for example. So the Quilombos, because it's really hard to conceptualize what was really the Quilombo. The Quilombo was a place where African enslaves would run away in the bushes of Brazil, the forests of Brazil, and then they would create realities, housing, agriculture. They would bring out the technologies that they have. And also, it's hardly documented. There's some documentation, but it's really difficult to imagine that this did not happen with the help or the support of the local indigenous populations, the Amerindians, because there was a lot of cross-reference of technology. There's a lot of techniques that were used from African technologies of agriculture and like wine making, butter making, that utilize ingredients that were utilized by the Amerindians. So, you know, the Palmares Quilombo, the Quilombo of Palmares had about 30,000 people at its peak. You know, there are cities right now, many cities in Australia right now don't have that sort of population, for you to have an idea. So 30,000 people fully functioning in democracy of the African democracy, but not in the way the European democracy, but it's a really communal way where, sorry, excuse me, close the door. Close the door, please. Close the door.
Do you have any more slippers?
Please, close the door. I'm sorry.
Do you have
Close
any
the
more
door.
slippers?
Yes, down there. Close the door. Close the door, please. I'm sorry. Yeah, the perils of having kids in the house. And the African kingdom that was part of this sort of grandiose idea, and they were resisting, even with some poor whites as well were also part of the of this sort of, not of the Quilombo, but they would trade with the Africans that were in the Quilombo. So the physical location of the Quilombo was destroyed in 1695, as I previously mentioned. However, the idea of Quilombo, of getting together as Black people, remained. And in Brazil today, Quilombo, who was a noun, became an idea, and today is actually utilized as a verb. So in Brazil, people say aquilombamento, which means to quilombo, to get together with other Africans or other Black people. And yeah, the similar ways that you could understand as in the Anglophone sphere, which is where I'm presenting, it's called a safe space for Black people. So people, and that's what the Afro-resistance group is today. There's no official data for the Afro-Brazilian population and Afro-Latin American population in Australia today, but based on the number of African descent, so it's about 1.5% of the people, you know, it's we would imagine that we are, you know, a very small population here, you know, because we are subsect of the African descent here. And then you have to also realize that a lot of Afro-Brazilians would affirm themselves as only Brazilians or, you know, Latinos. So it's really hard for us to have a number. But the group today, the Facebook group, has about 170 members. It's always not possible to talk about race and racism in Australia without mentioning the structural racism suffered by the indigenous populations in the past and today. So we also understand that as a reality, and it's very important to be educated about that within our group. So what's the positive impacts of having a group like that in Australia for Afro-Brazilians? So, you know, 75% of the members of the group that responded a survey that I prepared said that they made a new Afro-Brazilian friend, you know, at least, you know, some of them made 3 or more Afro-Brazilian friends. It's 25% of its members still haven't made any friends, but that might be for different circumstances, perhaps not engagement. Over 91% of the respondents of the survey affirm that the Afro-Brazilian resistance group is important for Afro-Brazilians living in Australia, in the diaspora, and over 80% feel more supported living in the diaspora living in Australia since joining the group. Again, I said, you know, also the conscience of being Afro-Brazilian, of being Black and Brazilian, raised on members an idea of Pan-Africanism that wasn't otherwise engaged and felt by the members before joining, or some of the members, and 63% of those members of the Afro-Brazilian groups have made African friends or Black friends that they would potentially otherwise not have made without the conscience of this Pan-African existence. 13% of the members also started to treat themselves with mental health, so seeing a therapist, which is also something that we widely talk about in the group's chats and Facebook and in person and the personal meetings. There's also 49% have used services or benefit from services offered within the group. The legacy of the Quilombo lives within us 5 centuries after the first capture and kidnapping of our people from the shores of Africa. And in fact, many members have not spent time with large numbers of other Afro-Brazilians outside of their own families. And also, of course, not Africans from the continent before. Many of the members never had that opportunity. So I believe that aquilombamento, that Quilombo, really benefited the members and demonstrate how well and crafted the colonizers in Brazil created this pseudo-apartheid where we are taught to be the exception, the exemption, and separated by our own people. Today, the Afro-Resistance group focuses as well on social events and social networking, Black money, which is like trading with our own group. Several members of the group exchange provisions of services and other work opportunities. And I see the group as a fully functional modern Quilombo. And unlike our ancestors that were utilizing the hoe and bare hands to build a better future, you know, building the Quilombo and planting and sort of getting the food from their own hands, we use tools, digital tools, technology tools, like digital communication and in-person communication to create this Quilombo. That's today I see more as an idea as opposed to just a place of just a physical location. And because the Brazilian history has been mostly written by white hands and by white male hands, I feel that reinterpreting and rewriting and writing new epistemologies and new understandings of the history, it's a step into the unknown, but it's a really exciting step for us Afro-Brazilians living in the 21st century. Thank you.
Well done, Guido. That was exactly on time. Well done for such an interesting talk. I'm sure people have a number of questions and reflections later on. So now we pass to the second paper by Franka, and the mic is yours, Franka. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Molla. And thank you everyone for making the time to be with us here today. As Dr. Molla said, my name is Franka Vaughan, and I'm a third year PhD candidate here at the University of Melbourne. And before I start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work, which is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to the elders past and present, and those with us here this afternoon. I acknowledge that their sovereignty was never ceded and their resistance to colonization is ongoing. I say this in solidarity with their ongoing struggle. Now today I'll be speaking to you on diaspora Liberians' perceived marginalization in their home country, Liberia, and in their host countries, and how such feelings of dual marginalization informs their demand for dual citizenship. And I should say that this presentation is part of, is a chapter I'm working on as part of my PhD thesis. My thesis is investigating identity construction in post-conflict Liberia. I am using Liberia's ongoing dual citizenship debate as a lens to understand and interpret the complex narratives around the construction of a collective identity as part of Liberia's ongoing post-conflict rebuilding process. In the thesis, I'm employing a mixed methods of narrative, document, and media analysis as part of the data collection and analysis process. And in this thesis, I draw on all sides of the dual citizenship debates, the argument put forward by those in favor of dual citizenship and those against, the argument of those in Liberia and those in the diaspora. But for this presentation, I am focusing on just one of the reasoning that underpins diaspora Liberians' demand for dual citizenship. Now, for the benefit of those who don't know where Liberia is, the map that you're seeing on your screen now is West Africa, and the area here that is shaded green is present-day Liberia. Now, in the literature, there's a talk of a major shift in the institution of citizenship due to increasing legitimation of dual citizenship around the world. And this discussion has generated what some are calling the post-exclusive turn in the institution of citizenship. What this means is that there's a redefinition of state membership, a shift from exclusive allegiance to the nation state to a more non-territorial status or portable citizenship. And what has inspired this turn, among other things, is global inequality and its impact on mobility and other opportunities. So basically, people want to improve their life chances within a global system of inequality that is premised on citizenship. And what people are doing is pursuing strategic citizenships that provides them premium passports, but also enables them to access health security and as well as options in terms of where they and their families can live, conduct businesses, study, and invest. But what is prevalent is that these studies have sort of focused on immigrant naturalization in industrialized Western countries, mainly asking the question whether the allowance of dual citizenship in Western Europe and North American countries, or in Australia, for example, increases the likelihood that immigrants there will naturalize. Also asking the question whether immigrants are less rooted. So while this body of work has produced some useful insight, it lacks a diversity of context, as well as the different pathways through which dual citizenship is produced, or in our case, contested. So, and one thing that I want to highlight is that when the lens of this study is turned to the global South in particular, the argument that usually informs the analysis tends to focus on the opportunities that strategic citizenship offers to elites. In recent years, however, there have been efforts to broaden the study of strategic citizenship. In 2008, for example, Yoshi Hapas and Pablo Matias edited a special issue in the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, which sought to redefine this concept and also provide a more nuanced understanding of the practical value that people derive from second citizenship and how such value is created within national and global systems of stratification. Now, my thesis, in its focus on diaspora Liberians' claim for dual citizenship in their home country, Liberia, I believe, contributes to this growing body of work. Now, going back to the context that I'm looking at, I believe Liberia is a very interesting case study in this instance because beyond the elect factor that I've already mentioned, there is the historical issue of the Liberian state using citizenship as a tool of exclusion in its early years of state formation. And then we have the civil war that devastated the country for over 14 years between the years of 1989 and 2003. And then before that, there were years of bad governance and political instability. What I'm trying to point out here is that there have been a lot of awful circumstances that drove many Liberians with different social standards out of the country in search of refuge across the globe. So diaspora Liberians will normally argue that many of them were forced to naturalize in their host countries, that a decision to adopt the citizenship of their host countries, knowing full well that Liberia does not allow dual citizenship, was an impossible choice. Yet they naturalized because Liberia was practically a failed state during the years of the Civil War in particular. There was no timeline to when the chaos will end. And naturalization and other residency status enabled them to access public services and opportunities that allowed them to help their family repatriate during the war years, as well as the right to access government jobs and other social services normally reserved for citizens and permanent residents. So the analytical call of the argument normally put forward by Liberians in the diaspora regarding the restoration of their Liberian identity, especially in the media and from my interviews, is around these three factors. Usually they talk about their economic utility, referring to the skills and technical knowledge that they have acquired in their host countries, and how beneficial it will be for the development process in Liberia if dual citizenship is allowed. They also point to their right as natural born Liberians, the fact that they were born in Liberia before they chose to or they naturalized in their host countries. And mostly they refer to this argument, they refer to it, the fact that the state was orchestrated the conflict in some way, and so it was not fair for it to sort of take away their citizenship. And one of the most popular arguments is around remittances, diaspora Liberians' continuous engagement in country through cash and kind. But another issue that I want to focus more here is an issue that they kept coming back to in the interviews, which is their need for a real home, a place to belong for themselves and their children, and how dual citizenship in their home country sort of factor into this need. Now here, I borrow Sarah Ahmed's 1999 definition of real home, where she defines this as the very space from which one imagines oneself to have originated, and in which one projects the self as both homely and original. So that's what Liberians seems to locate this need for a real home within a perception of dual marginalization that they experience in both their host countries and their home countries. So in Liberia, they feel ostracized due to their diaspora status. And in their host countries, be it in the US, the UK, and maybe, for example, Australia, they feel added because of their background as Liberians, as Africans, as Blacks, as migrants, as refugees, and all the different classifications that suggest that they do not truly belong to these places. So here I'm arguing that diasporic Liberians' claim for dual citizenship in their homeland, it's underlined by their racialized experiences as ethnic minorities in the global north. And I should state that I am using home here not merely as a geographical location, but as an emotional space that contributes to who we are as people and our identities. So who we are either as individuals or as part of a group is linked to where we feel at home. So leading to the first aspect, focusing on the contested identity of diaspora Liberians in their home country. Here they usually refer to the constant questioning of their identity. They felt that as members of the diaspora, their Liberianness is under constant scrutiny, especially when they return home, owing to a popular belief that what once made them Liberian has been eroded by their diaspora status, or the fact that they are not willing to give up their foreign citizenship. And I should state that Liberianness in this sense is a status that grants Liberians true belongingness to Liberia. It also provides them ownership over the country's resources. But this status is not given. So for example, in reference to, I'll focus on the second statement, where this respondent is a young, I'll classify as a young Liberian who lived most of her life in the US, but returned to Liberia after the end of the Civil War to work in the public sector. And in our conversation, she talked about how she had to, before leaving America to Liberia, she had to have a very frank but difficult conversation with herself and her mother, who was living in Liberia at the time, about how she was going to be treated in Liberia. So just to go through briefly what she said, my Liberianness wasn't a given. It wasn't a default. I now had to prove that I was Liberian. I knew my accent would be an issue, but I didn't expect to have to prove that I was Liberian practically all the time. I mean, we've been working together for months at this point. You know my mother, you know I'm a Liberian. This is not up for debate, and yet you are still quizzing me if I know different Liberian foods and things. So that's why Liberians consider the constant questioning of their Liberianness to be a tactic that Liberians in country use to assert their own superior connection to Liberia and ownership over the country's resources, whilst demonstrating that those who have returned from the diaspora or those who are in the diaspora do not truly belong to Liberia. But in spite of this contempt that they feel, they still consider Liberia to be their real home, and they seek true belongingness in Liberia. So, for instance, one of the people that I spoke to make this comment: we work and save for back home. We live in America for 20 or 30 years, but because of the need for the Liberian identity, we plan for back home. So the point that I'm making here is that Liberians desperately seek belongingness, and that's why Liberians seek belongingness in Liberia, because it is where they come from, and they believe that having access to dual citizenship will finally formalize their identity or their Liberianness and provide them a route back home when they are ready to go. Now, I want to move on to the other aspect of the debate. So in this case, their push for this dual citizenship is partly due to the lack of belongingness that they feel in their host countries, a feeling that is inspired by their racialized experiences as ethnic minorities. So here, their Liberian origin, a status that is questioned when they go back to Liberia, also serves as a justification for their otherness in their host countries, because this Liberianness or this origin serves as a basis for their minority status. They consider their racial ethnic background to be the key to their identities and sense of belonging in these Western countries, but it also underpins their marginalization, a means through which they are discriminated against. So, and here I'll focus on just the second statement here. So this is a respondent that I spoke to who described his home as a place where he can exist freely without intimidation or fear that the police were going to show up and arrest him. So here he says, as long as I've lived in the United States, I've never felt so comfortable until I went back to Liberia 6 years ago. When I got home to where my family lives, I felt a sign of relief that I could do a lot of things without looking over my shoulder to see who is going to arrest me for doing some of the dumbest things. That's comfort level for me. So this perception is influenced by the racialized experiences of Black and brown people in America. And he was one of many respondents who spoke to me about racial politics in the global north and the blatant racism against ethnic minorities in America and beyond. And what I found interesting is how they related it to the African-American situation in America, making the argument that these are people who belong to America as anybody else, and yet they are discriminated against. And based on that, they feel like they might never actually achieve that belongingness that they seek in this home country. So this respondent, for example, talked extensively about his experiences as a child in pre-war Liberia and his return to Liberia following the end of the Civil War to help rebuild his home country. He talked of a feeling of community and the sense of worth that he felt working and volunteering to teach employable skills to young Liberians. These are feelings that he said he never felt whilst having lived in America with his family for over 20 years. And so here he related his life as a child in Liberia to that of his children in America, emphasizing the lack of communal relations in America. So just to briefly read it, he says, in the United States, my kids, when they come home from school, they can't even leave the house unless I say, let's go to the park. When I was back home as a kid, and here he's referring to when he's in Liberia, I didn't have such supervision. I come back from school and I'm out there somewhere, but everybody in the community knew to watch over the kids. In the US, unfortunately, you cannot do that. So this respondent speaks with longing and nostalgia for his homeland, a place that to him represents safety, freedom, and community, and wishes his children would have a similar freeing childhood as he's had as a young boy in Liberia. And most of these respondents in our communication, one of the things that seems to bother them the most is the fact that they understand that they will never feel that true belongingness in their host countries. And yet where they actually call their home, they are questioned, their identity is questioned, their sense of belongingness is questioned because of their diaspora status. So just to relate it back to the literature that I talked about earlier, just to briefly say that that's what Liberians' construction of home is linked to their identities, and a threat to the former, which is their home, puts their identity also at risk. And the case study here suggests that, of course, that's what Liberians, they are American, they are Australian, and UK citizens, premium passport may give them the mobility and all the instrumental values that the literature promises, but it does not really provide them what they most desire, which is a place to actually belong and call their real home. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Franka. Just on time. Excellent. Again, the comments, questions, and reflections would should wait until the end of next session. So now the time is for David. The mic is yours. Thank you.
Thanks a lot to Tebeje and to the whole ASG team for the fantastic conference. And I'm here in Perth. I was really looking forward to coming over again to Melbourne to be part of it, but obviously that couldn't happen. We're not allowed to leave Perth, and you're obviously in lockdown there. And the last time I left Perth was actually for the ASG conference last year in March. So it's a shame I couldn't be there, but I do come from UWA in Western Australia, and I'm sitting here on Wajak Noongar land, and I acknowledge the traditional owners and pay my respects to their elders and emerging leaders in Western Australia. I'll just share my screen now. Okay. So this is a presentation to give a bit of an overview of some intersecting projects that we've been doing here at the Africa Research Engagement Centre at UWA around issues of development, diplomacy and the diaspora. This is a collaboration between many people. I acknowledge two other people particularly who have worked on this aspect of the project, my colleagues Farida, Fozdar and Tinashe, Jakwa, who can't join us for the presentation today. But we also have a range of other collaborators, including some of the people who are participating in the conference here. So I'll just give an overview of this work that we've been doing with the focus on diaspora, really over the last couple of years since 2019. Some of this work has been delayed by COVID. We had planned to spend some time on the African continent last year, which of course couldn't happen. And then I'll talk about some of the key findings and a key recommendation that we're making sort of coming out of these projects to date. So two of the projects are one focused on development, diplomacy in the diaspora, looking at how we can deepen engagement between African Australians, the diplomatic corps and the African Union's development and integration agenda, Agenda 2063. And that project's been funded through DFAT and the AAUN, Australia Africa University Network. And the second one is a project funded through a UWA collaboration grant on the transnational political economy of African migration to Australia. So these two projects started about the same time and have ended up kind of intertwining with one another. And we're just at the point of wrapping these projects up at the moment. So as part of this, we've done a number of activities, and again, several of the people in the conference have been involved in some of these. So we held a National African Australian Diaspora Engagement Conference in 2019 here in Perth, where we had leaders of different African communities from around Australia, from the different states, come and talk about the work that they were doing and the challenges they were facing. We also held an international research workshop last year in lieu of a planned workshop in Addis Ababa. So we had members from the African Union, from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and several academics from African and Australian universities partnering in that workshop. We then, at the same time, undertook a Delphi research process with several experts from both Australia and the African continent. So experts meaning people who have particular policy or research expertise or lived experience of migrating from or migration from Africa to Australia. And then most recently in November, we held an African Australian Diaspora Research Forum where we tried to bring some of this together and look at some of the policy recommendations that we could make coming out of the engagement that we'd had with all of these different stakeholders. So some of the outputs that have come so far from this project or series of projects. Firstly, the NADEC conference report, which is available on our website, and recommendations. We made submissions to the recent Australian Senate inquiry into issues facing diaspora communities in Australia. We've put out several academic papers for review, including one on the question of are Africans in Australia a diaspora? We've also put in a major ARC Discovery Project grant application, which includes people from around Australia. It's a large team. which in our view would be the opportunity to really generate the deep data that's not available at the moment. So in that project, we'd be looking at the political and economic agency of Africans in Australia to really understand what are the political roles that Africans are playing, what kind of economic interactions, particularly around remittances, are flowing between the continents, and a whole associated set of questions. So that's currently under review for next year. So fingers crossed. We've also got a new small project through the Scanlon Foundation looking at the question of African Australian youth navigating different identities, intersecting identities, multiple identities. And that will be a WA-focused pilot this year, and we hope to expand that to a national project next year. And then, as I said, we're finalising at the moment the two project final reports, which will include a full mapping study of the diaspora in Australia, the results of the Delphi survey, and some recommendations. So hopefully we'll be finishing those very soon. Just to turn to some of the different partners we've got on these projects, to acknowledge them, a range of organisations, AAUN and DFAT as funding partners, but also other government bodies, a range of African and Australian universities, and of course a range of African diaspora organisations in Australia. Okay, so some of the key findings, and there's a lot of detail that I'm not going to talk through. I'm just going to try and highlight some of the main findings that we've sort of worked through out of these projects. First is to generate some data on what is the African migrant population in Australia, both historically and as far as the last census was concerned in 2016. And through our research, we've identified about 600,000 people that could be that are either first or second generation Africans, so people either born in on the African continent or have at least one parent born on the African continent. So that equates to about 2.6% of the Australian population, which is quite interesting. And what we've seen is a substantial increase in the volume of that migration and the diversity of those coming from Africa since about the mid-1990s. And I'll just jump forward a couple of slides to show you some of that in these figures. So we can see here, historically going back to Federation of Australia, the only real African-born population allowed to come to Australia were from South Africa, mostly white population, of course, under the White Australia policy. From the 1940s, we started to see migration from Egypt specifically, and then from a range of other African countries. But it wasn't really until the mid-1990s that we saw really substantial increases, both in the overall volume, but also in the diversity of countries from where people were migrating to Australia. This is top 20 countries as of 2016 census. We can see that a bulk of this population comes from South Africa, Egypt, and Zimbabwe. Of the South African and Zimbabwe migrant populations to Australia, about 75% of those are of white European heritage. So that gets us thinking about what do we mean by African diaspora in Australia, and how do different groups interact with one another. And then in terms of spatially where those migrants have settled, in terms of Australian states, we can see that a state like Western Australia has an overrepresentation of African-born people compared to its percentage of the Australian population, so 21.6% of the African-born population, but only 10.6% of the overall population. Victoria has roughly equivalent to its Australian population, and New South Wales is perhaps underrepresented. Let's go back. So the research firstly asked the question of, what is a diaspora? And there's many different views of that, but a set of characteristics that we identified are a sense of shared origins, of collective identity, kinship or experiences, an orientation to the region of origin, in this case, the African continent, ongoing transnational engagements across political, economic, social and cultural spheres, often being the target of activities of home governments, both positive and negative, and also being constituted by both external and internal relations. So being defined by others, particularly in racial terms, but also in terms of internal attempts to build Pan-African consciousness and organisations. So against this, through the research, we've identified at least some evidence of emerging diaspora, African diaspora, if we can say that. So there's certainly a Pan-African consciousness underpinning collective identity in the development of some African Australian community organisations, not all, but some. Some are set up as Pan-African in structure and orientation. We've seen a range of different actors undertaking that transnational activity that's meaningful both to the Australian society and back to the countries of origin. And this helps in terms of building a diasporic identity. But at the same time, we caution that the significant diversity is of course, a great challenge to building a collective identity, and that there are these important cleavages amongst the diaspora populations. It's a very diverse, of course, set of migrants from an entire continent in Australia. So we essentially say it's difficult to reach generalisable conclusions at this stage, partly because much of the research is focused primarily on migrants from refugee backgrounds rather than those in the skilled and family streams. So we call for broader research to better understand the nature of the contributions and the activities of Africans in Australia, and that's where we hope to put the research from the ARC application into play, and to understand the different forces that are both encouraging and counteracting a greater diasporic consciousness. So I'll just skip through these again and to some of the sort of findings around recommendations. So as part of this, a common theme in much of the work that we've been doing is this wide frustration across different sectors, including community sector, including the education sector, the business sector, at the lack of Australian government prioritisation and resourcing to either deepen Australia's relationships with the African continent, African countries, or to support the fuller development of the diaspora here. But there is growing recognition of the importance of the diaspora to Australia. So we've seen, for example, the Advisory Group on Australia-Africa Relations strategy push for the creation of a diaspora unit within the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade itself, in the White Paper of 2017, really did give a bit more airtime to diasporas to talk about how they might be important to foreign policy in a general sense rather than African diaspora specifically. Of course, we had the Senate inquiry that published its report earlier this year, which was focused on issues facing diaspora communities and made several recommendations around things that the government might consider in terms of improving its own relationships with diasporas in Australia. And then sort of separately, we've had the African Union establish its own network within Australia, so the Pan-African Australasian Diaspora Network, or PADAN, to be the official linkage between the African Union's diaspora policy and the diaspora in this part of the world. So we argued that Australia currently lacks the national institutional capacity to really capitalise on the energy expertise, networks and so on of the African diaspora here, as well as other related sectors pushing for greater engagement. And our key recommendation, which I'll turn to on the final slide, is that we ultimately need to establish an Australia-Africa Council reporting to government if any of these sub-recommendations are going to be achieved. That's really the headline that we think needs to be established. And this was something that was proposed 10 years ago by a separate parliamentary inquiry and wasn't acted upon. And we see it as a missing link in the institutional architecture. On top of that, some of the recommendations that came out of our consultations were that the peak body for African communities in Australia, the Federation of African Communities Councils, needed to be revitalised and to play its role more effectively as a peak body, while other organisations, particularly PADAN, had an important role in facilitating more structured transnational linkages, back to the African Union particularly, but that it needed more resourcing and support. And we argue in this sense that doing so would be both in Australia's national interest, it would support Australia's foreign policy, it would help to understand issues like the concern at the moment around foreign interference and political interference by foreign governments. But it would also be in the interests of supporting the flourishing of transnational communities between Australia and Africa. And for us, this would represent the maturing of Australia's societal and governmental relationship with Africa and Africans. And so the final slide here is really what we would see as being the institutional architecture for the creation of an Australia-Africa Council. This is the missing piece of the puzzle, if you like. It's very difficult for other aspects to happen in the absence of this. We would see three pillars, particularly one for education, training and research providers, another around diaspora organisations and service providers, and thirdly around commercial organisations. They would report to this council, have representation on the council, and there would be an exchange then of resources. So coming up from these pillars would be research and expertise, training, policy advice to government, market advice to government, and coming back down from the council through government would be opportunities for consultation, structured consultation for these different stakeholders, opportunity to align strategic planning, and of course, as a level of certainty around resourcing, because many of us, I think, in these different pillars or sectors feel that we don't really have much resourcing, particularly grant funding, to do projects or activities that are focused on Africa or on African Australians. So this is a bit of a crude diagram, but this is the kind of thing that we'll be proposing to come out of these projects. Thanks a lot.
All right, thanks so much, David. That's an excellent presentation. Now, I invite the audience to ask questions, give comments and reflections.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So, for David, right? The presentation. I'm going exactly on a different direction, I think.
Yeah. Guido, can I stop you for a second? Yeah, just for clarification, you will continue. But for other members, please, if you want to ask question, just raise your hand in the reactions button down bottom, and go ahead, Guido.
Yeah. So because I'm sort of actually getting a bigger group with Brazilians or even Latin Americans, which is an even bigger group, and I'm really zeroing on this small group, which is the Afro-Brazilians. And David is actually talking this broader idea of understanding Africa from a business perspective, including white Africans, South Africans, Zimbabweans, colonizers. So why do you, what is the link? Like, they are Africans, but do you see them, how is their reality connected to Africa, except the fact that they are born there? Like, in the terms of economic, I would see them as a layman, as an outsider. They are, once they migrate here, I could imagine they would behave social, politically as Europeans. Does the fact that they are from the African continent wouldn't be, I can't find the relevance, but I don't know. I can't see the relevance of them, because I believe it's easier for it's just for a bigger understanding, it would be more easier to separate them as Euro-Africans. Yeah, I would like to hear your opinion on that.
Okay, thanks, Guido. So look, the reality is that about 40%, 50% of the people born in Africa are white Southern Africans. That's the reality of the demographics of those who have migrated to Australia from Africa. Now, whether we call that an African diaspora as a whole, that's a separate question, and that's exactly what we kind of probe in that one of those papers. Certainly, you would say that the white Africans have a different migration and settlement experience in Australia than those of Black or Indian or Asian or Arabic heritage from the continent. So I don't think you can equate them in that sense. But interestingly, and this question came up in almost every discussion we had with different stakeholders, there was quite a strong sense to include all people from the African continent in the discussion of an African Australian diaspora. There was quite a bit of pushback against the idea that we should exclude those of white African heritage from activities or being represented on councils and so on. So I guess what we're suggesting here is that we actually create the structures that can allow for different interests, different groups, different identities to participate in these discussions, because currently that's lacking. There's really no way to have a structured consultation around these issues. And so that's kind of the approach we're taking, but recognizing that there is these significant cleavages and significant diversity within that diaspora. And one of the questions we're asking is, are white South Africans or Southern Africans participating in other Pan-African organizations in Australia? Are they part of those or not? The evidence seems to say that they're not. They have separate organizations. And so does that then limit the possibilities of the kind of notion of Pan-Africanism in the diaspora? But there's really not much research into particularly diaspora organizations. And that's certainly something we want to do in the follow-on projects.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Anyone else? I don't see any hand. Okay, Kennedy can go on.
Thanks a lot, Chair, and thanks to the panelists for very interesting presentations. And it's very interesting how the themes, there are common themes across the various presentations. So in the interest of time, I'll direct my question to Guido, but the others might, depending on the time, at the chair's discretion, the others might jump in. And that's bringing in the dimension of Pan-Africanism in the context of the diaspora. It's very interesting to see how, for example, in Guido's presentation, the issue of belonging came out very strongly, where on the one hand, Afro-Brazilians have been in Brazil for a very long time, as well as other Afro-Latinos, but still trying to establish a connection with the African continent. So in this case, and also tied to the question raised by Guido, the notion of who's an African is quite nuanced, debated, and interesting, to put it that way. So in your case, Guido, how strong is the notion of Pan-Africanism in trying to establish the bridge or the connection between Africans in the diaspora, in this case, Afro-Brazilians or Afro-Latinos, and Africans from the African continent? And perhaps the others, if time allows and at the chair's discretion, others can reflect as well on how important Pan-Africanism is in the issues they've raised. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Beva. It's almost as if it's impossible to separate Afro-Brazilians after 5 centuries of being, Brazilians, but it's impossible also to separate us from being Africans. It's really this symbiotic relationship and this like we are both of those things. We like, you know, a lot of, we've been there enough time to like even getting, the government recognizes us, our people as indigenous to Brazil. So we have a lot of African quilombos have titles of indigeneity, like they receive titles as indigenous of Brazil because they've been there for a long time. And but at the same time, our culture, our food, our body, ways of behaving is entirely a lot African. And it is really important for us to really, like, there was a reason why education-wise, social-wise, the government of the colonizers, the Portuguese colonizers in our specific case in Brazil, utilized all tools possible on their disposal to attempt to separate us. And that was something that's being reconnected really strongly on the 20th and 21st century. But for most of the first four centuries of colonization, there was sold to us the idea that we were not Africans. And I specifically believed in that. And I know it's really not scientific to talk about I in academia. However, I think it is important for us individuals to create this sort of new epistemologies. And you know, there's a trans journalist called Louis Wallace, and they say that objectivity is the tool of the mainstream, you know, to maintain oppression. And I believe we should stop trying to attempt to be objective, you know, to give two sides of the opinions. There's no two sides. There's humanity, and there's those who wanted to keep their power despite anyone else's humanities, just theirs. And I know I might go alone on this for a while, but I think eventually, you know, more people will join, because it's important to put yourself into it. So for me, specifically, become an Afro-Brazilian as opposed to just a Brazilian, which I used to be 10 years ago, is being an act of liberty, of freedom, and connecting to people like you, and to be on this panel. It has an enormous power of transformation, in my opinion. Yeah, I think that's enough.
Thank you, Guido. David, Franka, do you have anything to add on to this, or should we continue to other participants?
Do you want to go first?
Yep.
Yeah,
go on.
you can go.
No, do you want to go first? Sorry.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I could say something about that. So I'll relate it back to most of my interviewees in the US, especially those are classified as young Liberians in the diaspora, and the emphasis that they placed on was how it was important that their parents made sure that they were connected to not just Liberia, but to the African continent. And so they talked about music and food and all the different things that they were introduced to, so that they will remain connected to the continent. That's why most of the people that returned back to Liberia to work after the war were people who had that connection with their country. They didn't grow up in Liberia, but they still had that connection, that I don't know whether I can classify it as Pan-Africanism for the continent and for their country. And so there's that connection. And I can actually speak to that in context of where I come from, Ghana, which Pan-Africanism is very, very important, especially even in the state framing of how it relates to the diaspora. And there's an establishment of institutions that try to track some of these diaspora members and try and include them in some of the things that the country is doing. So yeah, it's quite prevalent in Liberia and in Ghana, where I come from. Kennedy.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll just jump in as well. So I think this is a really interesting question. That, you know, what role does Pan-Africanism play in diaspora building within Australia? And I think there's at least a couple of aspects to it. One is obviously an effective aspect around people's sense of belonging and identity to the continent, which is really important. But also we need to look at it as a potential strategy for both individuals and communities in Australia. It can be a political strategy, it can be a community building strategy. I think that's particularly important both when you have relatively young migrant populations and also relatively small migrant populations, as with the African communities, perhaps outside of the South Africans, because it's potentially a strength in numbers strategy where if you band together with other groups, you can have more weight, you can have more expertise and so on, and that might be a useful strategy for at least the initial phase of integration into a society. But it's also a danger because of the stereotypes. So when we had the African gangs, media and political situation, all Africans in Australia were then affected by that. So there's a danger in being seen as a large collective because of those stereotypes, but it can also be used potentially effectively in other contexts as a political strategy. So I think this is actually one of the most interesting aspects that certainly needs further research.
Thank you, David. Simon, I can see your hands up.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks to all of the panelists here. It's been a really fascinating discussion. I had a question for David. I mean, firstly, also a comment, and I mean, I think your presentation was really fascinating. I think the answer, particularly to the first question, as a white South African myself, was also very interesting. I think I would certainly agree with you in your kind of inclination that white South Africans are not as involved within kind of diasporic or kind of Pan-African kind of organizations between Australia and Africa, within my limited time that I have had in Australia so far. I had a slightly different question on that, and I was wondering if you could expand a little more on the role of the African Union, particularly within these diasporas within Australia, for example, from the perspective of the African Union, if you can answer this, what do they kind of perceive the role of these diaspora groups as they kind of aim towards the African Union Agenda 2063? And then on the other end of the scale, from the perspective of these diaspora groups in Australia, how do they perceive the African Union? What are these kind of engagements like between the African Union and these diaspora groups here in Australia? Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. And just quickly on that first point, it's interesting that the South African High Commissioner to Australia currently is a white South African. So he's representing the current South African government in Australia. So that tells you a little bit about the South African government's, the way it understands the South African diaspora in Australia. Previously, it's been, we've had Black High Commissioners, we've had Sisulu family, as High Commissioners. So that's an interesting aspect of it as well. But turning to the African Union perspective, so the African Union, when it was formerly the OAU but reformed as the African Union in the early 2000s, didn't include diaspora in the Constitutive Act when it was first pronounced, but very quickly realised its mistake and made an amendment a year later to say how integral the diaspora was to the future of the African Union, the African continent. And since then has done quite a lot of work to try and build that at least kind of at a formal level. So officially the diaspora outside of Africa is the 6th region of Africa, according to the African Union, including the West, East, South, Central, North. The diaspora is the 6th region of Africa. So in that sense, they have been there's been an attempt to integrate them into the work of the African Union. And in the African Union's definition of what is the diaspora, it's a definition that basically says if you're African descent and you're willing to contribute to the African Union, then you're considered part of the diaspora. So it tells you a little bit about the African Union's motivation, I think, which is to draw on the resources of the diaspora to support the development of the continent. That seems quite clear. And they have various channels to do that. There's within the African Union Commission, there's the Citizens and Diaspora Organisations Directorate, which is the official kind of point of entry into the African Union system. And they were the ones that set up the Pan-African Australasian Diaspora Network in this part of the world as the kind of formal link. But on the other side, as you've suggested, what is the view of people in the diaspora of the African Union? I mean, we haven't done any comprehensive survey of that yet, but I would suggest that it's, there's very little real interest in what the African Union is doing, or knowledge of it. Of course, many people within the African continent don't have a lot of knowledge of what the African Union does, and this is a failing of the African Union to really sell itself to people on the continent, let alone in the diaspora. And of course, people also have their national affiliations as well. So I think there's potential for PADAN and other organisations to play a role in that notion of building connections to the African Union. But at the moment, I don't think it's very effective. It's still only a few years old in that sense, but there'll need to be a lot of resourcing and a lot of mobilisation within the diaspora to get people excited about contributing back to the African Union, particularly, I think.
Thanks, David. Perhaps I use the remaining minutes to ask a couple of questions as well. So, or reflect. I think the first point I want to ask Guido is about the Kilobo. I found it really fascinating, the story of the Kilobo, and I would love to hear from you if there is any comprehensive history of that event and that process that you can suggest to us. I would love to read more on that. I should confess, I have never heard of it, even though I'm always interested about African diaspora history. I really want to read more on that. As to David, I think that's, I remember also last year at the same event, you shared about the African Union and the possible collaboration. But what I don't understand, what I don't know so far is, I wonder, is there any evaluation reports regarding the effectiveness of the organization in terms of coordinating the African diaspora? Just to know if there is any, a genuine evaluation of their performance in terms of coordinating this critical mass, and to contribute to the continent. Franka, my question is, the predicament of every migrant is the feeling of not having that home as an emotional space, as you said, the feeling of neither here nor there, just being in between. Given that is, a shared experience of all migrants, whether African or otherwise, what do you think is the experience of other Africans? Have you come across other stories or accounts of other Africans in terms of this dual citizenship politics, and or just that shared, belonging to political entities at once? This just for you, Franka, if you have any material or any evident account of other cultural groups within Africa or beyond in terms of the dual citizenship politics. Yeah, thank you. Yep, anyone can go, Guido or Franka or David, jump in.
I like the Colombo. I think it's very interesting that you said it's fascinated and you don't know. Yep. And it's by design that you don't know. So white people, white Europeans, descendants, have been writing the history of Brazil for the past 500 years. And in fact, it's really interesting because I have to read what they are saying, and I have to interpret myself and remove the whiteness and then understand what the people were feeling, the Black people, the Africans were feeling at the time, because it's like, it's not what they're saying. And it's like you can tell that's interpretation is so flawed, and it's very easy to perceive if you have any basic critical understanding of what it is to be. Like they sort of interpret it sometimes as sort of monodimensional. And then the Quilombo idea, it's really fascinating because no one ever used the word kingdom. As far as I could find, I tried to find it. So maybe this is a word first. You know, I never seen it. And I cannot understand, if you have 100 years with a city running with 30,000 people, that's a kingdom. That's a kingdom. Like, and the Europeans writing that history could not bring themselves to call it a kingdom. You know, and I think sort of working more on that to really have the basis. You know, this is the beginning. This is my first academic paper, but this is the beginning of me delving deep into understand that as a kingdom, and then proving that's a kingdom, and then really presenting that as a kingdom. Can you imagine how Afro-Brazilians, you know, children will look at the past and see that there was a kingdom? You know, how Africans will even perceive the slavery, or, you know, of, you know, people from the continent will look, you know, like we create a kingdom. You know, we had like we tried. We didn't succeed, but doesn't mean we were not crafty enough to have, you know, tried in several continents, in different places. And you see how Haiti is paying today. They devastated economically the country. They punishing them to this date for that rebellion in the 1800s, you know, in the early 1800s. So I think that's, I will give you any information I have, but you have to understand that there's a lot of whiteness to get through, you know, around to understand. But it's you know, yeah, I think that's it. Yeah, but that's a conversation, and it's the beginning of the conversation. You know, I'm 40 years old. Maybe by the time I'm 50, 60, we're gonna get something. You know, it's a few years, but it's a project that is really important to me. Watch this space.
Thank you, Guido. Appreciate it.
Okay, so Dr. Molla, I just want to sort of comment a bit on your question. So you said that the feeling of belonging either here or there is a general feeling that is usually felt by migrants, and that is correct. That is conversations that I have with myself and with my partner, and even within the African Study Group, that is something that we continuously talk about. But I think what is unique in the context that I'm studying Liberia is the fact that, so for instance, I'm Ghanaian, and of course I have that feeling. But if I should decide to become an Australian citizen, my Ghanaian citizenship is still there. But in Liberia, I think it's about one of 7 countries in Africa that immediately you take up the citizenship of another country, your Liberian citizenship ceases, and your access to own land, for example, is taken away from you. And there's also the issue of the whole conflict, and a country that is trying to recover from the conflict. So building that identity is part of the nation building project. Some of these diaspora members see that they can contribute to the process going on there, but of course they don't want to give up the citizenship that they've acquired in some of these host countries because of the benefits it gives to them and their families, which is totally understandable. So personally, from my studies, I feel it hits a bit more for the Liberians because of the situation that their country is in now, and then having your citizenship taken away from you because of a situation that you didn't create. As I said in my presentation, they mostly argue that they were forced to naturalize because of the conflict. They had to do it to move away from the refugee status and all the other connotation, the negative connotation that comes with it. So they believe that their situation is a bit precarious than other migrants or other Africans who are dealing with the same feelings of not belonging either here or there.
Oh, thank you. I think it makes sense, especially when you are forcibly displaced from your own place. In my case, for example, I am originally from Ethiopia, and the moment I received Australian citizenship, I had to leave my Ethiopian citizenship. So if I have to go back to Ethiopia, I have to get visa. to my own country. So that, but you know, that feeling, you know, always I feel really that feeling of in-betweenness is really always there. So, but that point of forcibly displaced people, that's a different kind of category as well. So it makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. It's brought a lot of reflection, sort of think about beyond the Liberian case. So thank you.
That's no worry. All right.
Thanks, Tebeje, for the question. So I haven't seen any evaluation so far of the effectiveness of the PADAN specifically, or any other initiatives that have been set up by the African Union in Australia. I think, yeah, in its defence, it's been set up as a network, a loose network, rather than a kind of formal organisation expected to, you know, achieve certain objectives. But there has been participation by members of PADAN in various activities on the African continent, various conferences and other forms of input from the diaspora.
Yeah,
so
probably I should have been more, a bit clearer from my side. What I meant was in terms of African Union, not particularly in PADAN. Just as at the union level, is there any evaluation, like in terms of coordinating the diaspora?
But I think it's done out of a very small office with only a handful of people, and I think there's a debate going on in the comments right now about the African Union itself, and I would agree with Surjit's perspective that the AU is not a strong institution and lacks resources, so very, very difficult to do that. Now, the secondary question is whether the Australian government or other entities in Australia have an interest in supporting that kind of network financially or organisationally. And what kind of ends might be expected from that. But it's really too early to see any concrete outcomes of that yet.
Just a follow-up question, David. Sorry, guys, because I don't see any hands up, so that's why I'm talking. Do you see any change from the Australian government in terms of strategic alliance with the continent? Like, do you see any? Is there any change in terms of seeing Africa as a, you know, a strategic place? Or
well, I think there's been a change, but a negative change. I think 10 years ago there was more enthusiasm by the Australian government than there is now. There's almost nothing at the moment that I can see of any real strategic engagement. In fact, there's been a further withdrawal because of COVID and other budget cuts and so on. So there's actually very little going on right now at the governmental level, and hence our proposal to say, you know, create a structure. There's a lot of energy amongst the, you know, the academics and the students and the diaspora organisations and even some of the business organisations, but it's not being channeled effectively or strategically by the government. I think that's a loss to the government and to the various stakeholders involved.
It's interesting. Well, hopefully you succeed, and especially if you get that DP funded, that would be great to put more resource on that. Good luck with the DP one. Any question before we close? We have 3 minutes. All right. That means you have won the session for presenters, and thanks so much. I really appreciate. It was brilliant, wonderful, insightful session. I personally have learned a lot. As I said, you know, I had no idea about Kilobu. I'll keep reading, and David, your work in terms of bringing the visibility, especially the African Australian engagement is great, and I hope you and your team continue working on that. And Franka, that's the dual citizenship politics and the struggle of Liberian diaspora. That's really interesting. I am sure it will serve as a model to understand the experiences of other African diasporic here in Australia or elsewhere. So good luck with your PhD, and it's a fascinating topic. Thank you, Franka.
Thank you.
All right, with this, I will, Simone. It's applause. So yeah, everyone, please give a virtual applause, please, to applause for our presenters. And I'll see you in the next session then.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Tebeje, for the wonderful facilitation for this. And thank you all the presenters. That was very fascinating discussion, and all the participants for an engaged panel. We would go for a break now, and it's for 30 minutes.